Welcome and hello, I'm Rachel Bustamante, Campaign Coordinator at Plastic Pollution Coalition. We thank you for joining our June webinar, Sea Change, Advancing a Strong UN Plastics Treaty. Plastic Pollution Coalition is a nonprofit communications and advocacy organization that collaborates with an expansive global alliance of organizations, businesses, and individuals to create a more just, equitable, and regenerative world free of plastic pollution and its toxic impacts. Today, we have 4 poll questions to get a sense of who is joining us. Each question will only appear for about 20 seconds, so please answer those quickly. Poll 1, where are you joining us from today? Looks like majority is joining us from North America, and we've got a few folks joining in internationally as well. We're glad you're all here today. Let's get into our second poll. What best describes the area of focus of your work? Select 1. Okay, looks like we have a good mix here. Most nonprofit and got some corporation and business represented as well. Glad you're all here as well. Thank you. And poll 3, have you been following the UN Plastic Treaty negotiations? Select 1. Great, well, we're glad you're here to learn with us. Looks like most have somewhat been following it or are here to learn. So we'll definitely get into it and give some intros to it. And our last poll, which priorities do you believe are the most important for protecting oceans in the Global Plastics Treaty? And you can select all that apply. All of these are important. Highest one I'm seeing is to reduce plastic production at the source, very important, and to phase out single-use plastics. Thank you for participating in the poll questions. Today, we are going to be hearing from Christopher Chin, Graham Forbes, and Marce Gutierrez Grandich in conversation with Catherine Nelson. So it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, plastic-free mermaid, Catherine Nelson. Catherine is a leading environmental activist and sustainability advocate with over 2 decades of experience focused on ocean conservation and plastic pollution. A pioneer in living completely plastic-free for over a decade, Catherine has inspired millions to adopt zero-waste lifestyles. Her platform is dedicated to creating change at scale, with a focus on sustainable solutions that benefit both the environment and society. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you, Rachel. Hello, everyone. So nice to be here with you all. I'm tuning in from Bundjalung country here in Australia. It's just becoming morning time. It's lovely out today. I would like to now introduce our first panelist, Graham Forbes. Graham Forbes leads the Greenpeace Global Plastics Campaign, which aims to end plastic pollution and accelerate a just transition towards a zero-waste, climate-safe future. Graham works with campaigners worldwide as the Greenpeace head of delegation to the United Nations negotiations to secure a strong, ambitious global plastics treaty. Welcome, Graham.
Thanks, Catherine. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you. So, all right, I'm going to talk a little bit just about sort of what the Plastics Treaty represents as an opportunity, where we are, and where we're going. And so I think many of you are familiar with sort of the plastic pollution crisis is really one of the most pressing environmental challenges of our time. And so while we see plastics everywhere in our world, I think it's important to note that plastics is not just a pollution issue, but it's really seen at the core of what we call a triple planetary crisis. Plastics is fueling climate change, biodiversity loss, and polluting nearly every corner of our planet. Plastics is also creating sort of a public health crisis of unimaginable scale. We have microplastics in our bodies, in our brains, in our blood, and we're poisoning our children with microplastics before they are even born. And so while we know that the impacts of plastics are massive, the treaty setting global rules to actually address the problem really represents a once-in-a-generation opportunity to come up with solutions to create a safer and healthier planet. So back in March of 2022, the United Nations Environment Assembly agreed sort of what's called Resolution 514, which was a mandate for governments to negotiate a global plastics treaty. It was hailed at the time as one of the most significant environmental deals since the Paris Accord. And more than anything, it was sort of a mandate for the world to come together and created an opportunity for us to work towards meaningful regulations that would guide and restructure how the world relates to this sort of problematic substance. more than anything, from the Greenpeace perspective and many of our allies in the Break Free from Plastic movement, the problem with plastics is that we just fundamentally are creating too much of it. The industry, which the fossil fuel and petrochemical companies are looking to expand plastic production and petrochemical growth as a way to offset declines in energy and transportation that they're facing as a result of efforts to address climate change. And so they're massively looking to expand plastic production. We have recycled less than 10% of plastic that's ever been produced based on how much we produce now, and that is only going to grow exponentially worse. The treaty represents an opportunity to have regulations sort of upstream so that we can set a global target to reduce how much plastic we produce in the first place. There are very important sort of midstream and downstream measures in the treaty, but none of those will be effective unless we reduce the amount that we produce so much in the first place. So again, this is the lifeboat, sort of the plan B for the industry, unfortunately, is plastics and petrochemicals. Many familiar companies here: INEOS, Exxon, Chevron, Dow, SABIC. These are the companies that are one of the not only the biggest producers of plastic, but also the biggest obstacles to us agreeing an effective plastics treaty. The negotiations are really flooded with lobbyists from these countries. They spend an immense amount of money nationally ensuring that governments do not agree anything that would inhibit their ability to produce plastics in perpetuity for the rest of time. And so where there's a lot we can gain in the treaty through reducing plastic production, it's also a massive risk in the sense that if we agree a plastics treaty that doesn't reduce production, we will have memorialized in international law the right of these companies to poison people in our planet for generations to come. So it's complicated. There's almost 200 governments involved in the negotiations, and so Greenpeace and our allies are talking to governments all over the world. This is sort of a test of how much you know about national flags. It is complicated. We are really, the strategy that Greenpeace and our allies are working towards is pushing more ambitious countries that are listening to scientists and what justice demands. And so how do we empower those governments to really step up and call for a treaty that makes a difference in the world and that's going to set the rules that we need to make progress? Okay, I'm going to run through quickly where we have been. We are heading towards Geneva, Switzerland, which will be the second half of what was supposed to be the final negotiations. But we started in Punta del Este, Uruguay. This was the first treaty negotiation, and I think everyone was just getting sort of trying to understand the terrain. What did this mean? And so it's been very slow. This was a very slow meeting, mostly around procedure. We did not make much progress. From Uruguay, we went to Paris, France. And while Paris is beautiful, I think in many ways INC2 was where Saudi Arabia effectively planted a very sort of a poison pill, or sort of flexed their muscle around the rules of procedure, as it's called, which forces consensus as a decision-making process to agree the treaty. As you know, it's very difficult to get everyone to agree to anything. And so now that's part of the challenge that we have, is the process of how we get to an agreement. From Paris, France, we were in Nairobi, Kenya. And again, it was a slow meeting, but we started to get to some actual negotiating, which was progress. And you'll see from each of these pictures, civil society has been a critical voice at each of these. And these are our colleagues at Greenpeace Africa that hosted an amazing march ahead of the negotiations to set the tone. From Nairobi, we were in Ottawa. Again, behind schedule, but this is where we got into meaningful negotiations. There was more hope, I think, that we could actually begin to get into the substance of the issues and move away from process. Again, a powerful shot from some of our indigenous allies that were on the ground, sort of lobbying and pushing governments to do the right thing. So Busan, South Korea, this was really a turning point in the negotiations. And so this was meant to be the final negotiation. And so the media, where everyone was asking, will we get a treaty? We did not get a treaty in Busan. And while we did not get a treaty, Greenpeace and our allies very much saw Busan as a success for a fundamental reason, which takes us to the next slide. Busan was a turning point. For the first time ever, we had more than 100 countries actually stand up in a meaningful way to demand a treaty that cuts plastic production, bans toxic chemicals and products, and provides the financing that's going to be necessary for governments to make this transition. It was a huge moment. It was just the end of last year, and so you could see it made it in the narrative and the media. It was very powerful to have this sort of narrative out there that an effective treaty means reducing plastic production. So we saw this again, it actually cut through the media narrative, which is powerful. And that takes us to Geneva, Switzerland in August. And so this is where we are building right now. And so we are trying to continue the momentum that ambitious governments created in Busan. We're going to carry that to the second half of the INC 5, which is 5.2 in Geneva, Switzerland. The most important thing we can do is cut plastic production with this treaty. We're going to ban single-use plastics, toxic products, and provide the financing that's going to be required for the transition. Greenpeace will be there with all of our allies, and it's very difficult politics. The changing governments around the world, especially the US, is unhelpful, as you can imagine. But what's important is that everyone knows what we need to do. We just need the political will to be there. So we ask you to join us, and you can find Greenpeace online. Join the plastics campaign, join Greenpeace and Break Free from Plastic and the Plastic Pollution Coalition. There's lots of ways to engage. It's a massive opportunity, but it will only be taken advantage of if we have people like you joining us, calling on governments to stand up and show the courage that's going to be required to address this pressing global problem that affects every single person. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. So inspiring. Next, I'd like to introduce Marce Gutierrez-Graudens. Marce Gutierrez-Graudens is an award-winning global ocean justice leader committed to reimagining power, policy, and leadership in climate justice. She is the founder of Azul, an innovative movement and global network of Latinx leaders committed to galvanizing the climate justice field to boldly push for policies that serve the people. Marce's work has reimagined environmental conservation policies to place care for people at the center and transformed justice-driven ocean policies locally and internationally. Welcome, Marce.
Thank you again so much for the invitation. Thank you for the ability to be here, and thanks to everybody that's tuning in. So first of all, I will say on the logistics note, I am joining you all from Panama City, Panama, where we are attending the regional consultation in preparation for INC 5.2 for the working group of Latin American countries and the Caribbean. So it's been a very exciting time to be here and to join you today. So yes, Azul, we are a US-based organization working with Latinx community, Latino community, both US-based and diaspora coming from all over Latin America. We are what used to be described as the intersection of environmental justice and ocean conservation. We now have a fabulous new term, which is ocean justice. And that is basically ocean conservation that very much places human rights at the center of our work. You know, culturally, this work for us has been at the forefront, and you can see some of our graphics there. As an ocean conservation organization, this was something that was very much important to us, understanding from this traditionally and outdated view that plastic pollution and problem with plastic was sort of like a specific marine pollution. But really, we have thankfully come to understand that this is something that goes far beyond the shore. So you can see some of our involvement there in the INC process, and before that, specifically conversation around environmental justice and plastic pollution. Exciting to be here with our colleagues today and have been able to do this work in community with our colleagues and with the public. I will say this is something that for us, even when we are thinking of reducing our participation in any kind of plastic policy, keeps coming up because this is something that the public is extremely, extremely interested in, and you will see some numbers that I'll share with you in a little bit. So this is something that even if for some bizarre reason we decided to not do anymore, we would not really be able to step back because it is something that drives people's interest, that they're very concerned about and excited to take part in solutions. One of our initial engagements in this process is a report that was commissioned to us by UNEP, and actually you'll hear from one of our co-authors here as well, called Neglected, which is basically the first time that the UNEP, that's the UN Environmental Program, came out and declared that plastic pollution was really an issue in environmental justice. Why is this important? Again, because we have in the past talked about this misunderstanding that it was nothing more than a marine issue. But again, one of the things that's extremely important for us to understand is that we all are very obviously familiar with the pictures of the turtle with the straw up its nose, or the other animals that are dealing with that problem. But by the time that waste, that straw, that other plastic is harming wildlife, it has left a veritable wake of destruction in its path. By the time that we see the plastic actually hit the water, we have to understand that it has left problems from the extraction of the source materials, talking about, like Graham was pointing out, the fossil fuels, from the actual transportation of them to the transformation of them to the waste as well, right? So this is something that we need to keep thinking about in a global sense, not just in the global sense of the treaty, but in a broader understanding of the problem. So if you go to this report, which there's a handy QR code there, I will say that when we were commissioned to write this report, it was really interesting that we thought that this was going to be something that would impact maybe Sustainable Development Goal number 14, life below water. And we started doing our work in the research, obviously. And what we found in running our analysis is that it actually impacted every single one of the 17 goals. We talk about the rights of women and children, how people are impacted, health, obviously, even industry, et cetera. So, and you can see that handy little chart in the report that you see there. It is extremely, extremely important that as we talk about this treaty, as we talk about the strengths that this needs to contain to be successful, we are really looking at the folks that are the most impacted, and that we are really looking at all of the effects, and not just diminishing it or oversimplifying it to one particular waste problem. And this not turns into being a waste management problem. I will say that even though this report is now actually 4 years old, I think there's been a slew rather of other fabulous reports that you can find on this. So it's very exciting to see a broader understanding of this. And I think that it's a conversation that needs to continue to happen. There needs to be more of this analysis to highlight that connection between environmental justice and plastic. For Azul, a successful global plastics treaty at the forefront must have a priority on health and human rights. And again, this is what we're talking about, ocean justice. It needs to address that full cycle of plastics. And no, I'm not going to say the full life cycle of plastics, because that's a misnomer. And that includes those global targets to reduce production, like Graham said. And one of the things that has been a conversation here in this consultation, and I expect will be one of the bigger discussions in Geneva, is to have a very specific, detailed financial mechanism, right? So that we are not locking ourselves in to inadvertently or unfortunately doing any kind of harm in some of these mechanisms. So they're really making sure that these could serve as a remedy, that these could serve as something that moves a environmental justice and ocean justice conversation forward through this mechanism. And so we need to make sure that there's equity, transparency, and accountability, because we have seen it obviously with other treaties and other multilateral agreements that could be sometimes a unintended side effect that we should learn from, and that we should incorporate these lessons learned into something that is really putting the health and human rights first through that accountability of the financial mechanisms. And so here, one of the things that we do at Azul is that we run a national poll every 2 years around the issues that folks want to talk about. And so, we never know what these numbers are going to come back with. And I will say that our pollsters keep being both excited and double, triple checking these numbers, because the progressive thought and the feeling of voting Latinos in the US is extremely high relative to their attitudes around plastic pollution, their attitudes around a legally binding international treaty, their attitudes around the financial and legal accountability of manufacturers. And so again, you see that there, 75% of US Latino voters support creating a legally binding international treaty, even if it means, and here you have just the pollster speak, that sort of double check on, the US may have to follow difficult and expensive rules. And one thing that I really want to highlight here is that these results are positive across the board, regardless of people's political leanings. And so you obviously have 83% amongst Democratic voters, but you also have 62% of Republican voters agreeing with us on this. 72 somewhere in the middle among independent. And again, I will highlight the fact that there is that accountability, financial and legal accountability people want to see. That extends as well to the regulation of use and types of chemicals and plastics. Again, positive across the board, progressive across the board. And this understanding, and really what should be taken as a call to action from government actors, that 85% of Latinos in the US, this is a message for the US, I guess, believe plastic pollution will get worse if the government does not do something to prevent it. So there is a clear and conscious call to effective policy action on this. Like I said, even when if ever decided that we were tired of this, which is not going to happen anytime soon, we have this clear mandate from public that's interested, ongoing, and growing about the concern for plastic pollution. And so here you will see our updates from the negotiating meetings where we put our proposals, and we will be uploading more of those going into the 5.2 briefs, etc., that you can find yourself, avail yourself of if you find them helpful. Next slide with my contact information. So thank you again. And on to Christopher. Thank you again for the invitation.
Gracias, Marce. And now I would like to introduce our final panelist, Christopher Chin. Christopher Chin is a scuba master instructor whose passion for the ocean stems back to childhood. In 2006, Christopher co-founded the Center for Oceanic Awareness Research and Education, now known as CORE, and he continues to serve as its executive director. Christopher is an active participant in international fora and has addressed various bodies of the United Nations on multitudes of occasions, and is actively working towards a new global treaty to address plastic pollution. Welcome, Christopher.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be in such great company. We are excited to continue this fight. And for those who are not familiar with CORE, CORE is the international leader in ocean diplomacy, driving systemic change for the health of our people and planet. I've known Marce and Graham for many years, and it's exciting to see this change take place over so many decades. One of the things that Graham had pointed out was the path from the fabled INC or the UNEA 5.2 and its landmark resolution 514, which was hailed to end plastic pollution. And I will apologize, I don't have slides for this. I'm just going to run through some dates and some background that led up to the INC to give some history and meaning around how we got to where we are. So some of you are new to this process, as we noted in the polls, and that's great. We're excited to have your interest and your excitement around this issue. It is hard not to realize it. It's in the news. The plastic is literally everywhere. It's in the air that we breathe, the food that we eat, the water that we drink. It is literally everywhere. This is not a new concept, though, and it goes back to even the very first UN Environment Assembly in 2015. And the first resolution there was entitled Marine Plastic Debris and Microplastics. And over the years, the focus and the title of some of these documents has changed, but it's been the same. Like there's stuff going on, there's stuff in the ocean, and that's how CORE first came about and became interested in plastic pollution, because it was ending up in the ocean. This was a problem for us and the animals and the health of the ecosystem. But then we quickly learned that it was so much more than just the plastic in the ocean. And that is exciting to see that evolution of the focus from just marine debris, marine litter, to plastic pollution as a whole and leading back up to the source and where it's actually coming from and being produced and the extraction of the raw materials. That was back in 2015, the second UN Environment Assembly. There was another resolution, also relatively weak, I'll call it, non-committal. That's probably a more diplomatic way to put it. The UN uses many verbs in their documents, and they range from decides and commits and things like that are very, very specific to the really weak language like invites, notes with concern. Like these are things that are basically fluff and not really saying anything, but just saying, okay, yeah, we note with concern that there's plastic in the ocean. We note with concern that people are dying. This is not really making anything happen. But as we move forward, at the very first UN Ocean Conference in 2017, CORE had the privilege and the honor of addressing the UN at the Ocean Conference on behalf of many organizations, including Plastic Pollution Coalition, where we called publicly to the United Nations asking for global collaboration, pushing towards a treaty and an eventual document like the one that we're working towards now. And I'll be honest, back then people laughed at us. They thought, well, it's the UN. Do you know how slowly that moves? It's never going to happen. That's a joke, but good luck. So it's exciting to see that we're here where we are now. Over those years, it was several more UNEAs, several more UN Environment Assemblies before we actually got actual movement and I'll say traction on this. And in the next UN Environment Assembly, the third UN Environment Assembly, it created the ad hoc open-ended expert group. And basically that was a call to bring experts together all over the world to discuss the problem and potential solutions. And there were a lot of people in this room. I remember Marce being there, and she was a panelist at one of the early expert group meetings, bringing attention to environmental justice aspects of this, and that was exciting to bring that into the fold. But back then, the industry was very, very involved, as they still are today, but they didn't have that many people. We would see the same characters over and over, and it was the same thing. They would try to derail the conversations, and they dragged it on for years and years, basically saying, we don't need a treaty. A treaty's a bad idea. It's a terrible idea. We don't want that. And now the tune has changed. Now it became too embarrassing to say we don't want a treaty anymore because of public perception. Now they say, okay, we want this legal document, we want this legally binding document, but now they're trying to weaken it. And as Graham pointed out, if we don't get this right, we're going to forever cement poor practices, and we're going to cement the I hate to say the right of the industry to continue to poison us, and that is not what we want. The problem is that when you have the industry in the room that's making the decisions, they're the ones that it's like you can't ask somebody to restrict themselves. It's like if you have a child and you ask them what they want for dinner and they say ice cream, if they have the power to choose what they want, then they're going to have the ice cream. They're not going to ask for the broccoli. Almost every language that I'm aware of has a phrase that is along the lines of "fox in the hen house," and it basically, it is what we understand it to be. You can't have somebody in control of something that they have a vested interest in because they are going to make poor decisions, or they're going to make decisions that are not in the best interest of the constituents. So that's where we are now. And we have people in there that are trying to steer this in the wrong direction. And it is something that we very much need to be aware of, that we need to avoid, and that we need to call attention to. There was a similar process 20 years ago, actually. The framework on the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And as you can imagine, the tobacco industry is very interested in not being controlled. So they were actually excluded from the process. And that is something that we would love to see similar take place in our endeavors here. Because if we can exclude, or at a minimum identify, who the industry speakers are, then we can all try to take what they say with a grain of salt, or understand that they're speaking out of the side of their mouth, as we say. And this is something that is extremely important as we move forward, to understand who is saying what and to understand where their loyalties lie.
Thank you, Christopher. Love the analogy to the tobacco industry. We're now going to move on to the discussion part of our panel. I'll start by asking our panelists some questions submitted by attendees ahead of time. Please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the chat here, and we will do our best to answer them live. Given the pervasiveness of plastic on this planet and recent revelations that microplastics are even in the placenta of pregnant women, what are the possibilities that we will ever be free of plastics?
I mean, that's obviously a difficult question in terms of predicting the future, but I think what we absolutely do know is that we can stop making so much of it. And having worked on this issue for a lot of years, I think it's just clear we have not been trying, really. Like, there are not a lot of meaningful regulations, either at the regional, local, state level, for how we address this problem. And given the transnational nature of plastic pollution, the treaty really represents sort of one of our best and most immediate opportunities to set a framework for how we deal with this collectively. And so, because we haven't been trying, just minimal effort, I think, will produce massive results. And because plastics has such pervasive impacts on our climate, biodiversity, and our health, just taking those basic steps is going to pay massive dividends for our children. And so, I can't predict when we'll stop seeing microplastics in fetuses and sort of when we'll see reverse those. But I know that taking these steps now is going to be massively helpful for future generations. I've got kiddos, and I know that we want all of our kids to be healthy. It's a priority over bottom line and profits for the fossil fuel industry. So,
thank you, Graham. This question's for Christopher. How does the Global Plastic Treaty need to complement and work together with other multilateral environmental agreements?
It's interesting because a number of the arguments against the plastics treaty and against the expansion of very important characteristics like the listing of toxic chemicals or chemicals of concern are overlapping in some ways with other multilateral agreements. And the industry and their friends often use that as an excuse to not touch this, because if we are dealing with waste in the Basel Convention, for example, then we don't have to deal with it in the Plastics Treaty. But that is untrue, because there are certain aspects that are controlled by these other agreements, but are not controlled in any way, in a robust way, or in the entire view of extraction to the end of life of plastic products and their wake of destruction, as they put it. So it's important that this is a complement to all the things that are already there, and that it helps to support the things that are in the process now. We learn as we go, and no one particular agreement will ever be perfect, and that's why we keep making agreements. We come to new understandings and new decisions. So this is important, that the Plastics Treaty helps to uphold the things that we're trying to support in other treaties, and that those treaties help to support the work that is so important for the Plastics Treaty.
Yeah, we need to build on our wins. Absolutely. Marce, which countries are leading for a strong global plastics treaty, and in Latin America particularly?
This is a point of particular pride for us coming from the region, to see these strong and science-based, ambitious positions that the Latin American countries have taken on here. So coming from, again, the consultation today, at the top of the list, I think that if people were listening from Busan, there's this specific rock star moment with both. I think both of them had the representatives from Panama and Mexico had very great rockstar moments, rallying that interest and really uniting up to, 100 countries, almost 100 countries to restate that interest. Because when you're in the middle of the conversation and you have, this bad faith actors or bad faith action rather, in this, it is hard to continue and become productive. So one thing that I would like to celebrate and highlight is that I think that GRULAC in general has been significantly great. One of the things that I would like to point out is a very structured and formalized ability for civil society to take part in their consultations and take part in their meetings while we're at the negotiations. And that obviously could probably be traced to the fact of the Escazú agreement, which is specifically that agreement that was signed amongst 25 Latin American countries to highlight the nexus between health, environmental justice, and human rights, and also to codify that right to information, participation, etc. So it's really exciting because you do see them living this and putting that into action every day. And so it at the same time it's hard because you have people that don't necessarily keep this in mind, and we've seen some of the concerns around the participation not being the easiest for civil society throughout the different venues and the processes, whether that is capacity, whether that is like we had in Paris, almost like a very limited participation at one point. Obviously some of them have that happen behind closed door, but it's very exciting to see Latin America. And obviously I think the folks from Africa are also very strong, but knowing this and working in the region, it's a point of pride to see that. And we hope that they continue to keep that focus on human rights, environmental justice, and we hope that that continues to be a rock star and that a whole lot of other countries take that inspiration going forward.
Absolutely. I love these rock star moments.
Fully.
So encouraging for people to get involved, and we can do it too. So it's wonderful. Thank you for sharing those. Speaking of inspiring, given the shift in the federal administration in the US, how do you imagine the US will show up in negotiations? This is to all or anyone. And what can we do through advocacy, especially when the US does not consider this commitment important? What are ways through NGO, religious groups, etc.? So how do you imagine the US will show up in negotiations, and what can we do in the US?
I'll go ahead and start with an interesting observation. And during some of the expert groups back in the, it must have been 2018 or so, or 2017, 2018, the United States at the time was not very helpful in those negotiations, in those discussions, and in those meetings. And in fact, one of the lead negotiators, I recall standing up at one of the meetings, and he said that the United States would, from that point on, refuse to participate in any further meetings where discussion of a treaty was on the agenda, and was very adamant that they would not even show up if that appeared on the agenda. So we kind of danced around that, and eventually we see where they are now, and up to UNEA 5.2, then they were among the groups who were saying, this is a great idea. We want a legally binding document. So obviously there was a change in administration in there that helped to shift that point of view. But we also need to realize that the United States is very, very reliant on its friends in the industry, and they are very, very much listening to what the industry has to say. And unfortunately, with the more recent shift of administration, I think that is just going to continue. And we see ramblings of that in different things in the media and the different ways that people show up. And I knew that this was not going to be good when the current president went to Saudi Arabia, and they made a big deal about him going to Saudi Arabia. So you can bet your bottom dollar that this was a topic of discussion. So my feeling is that the United States is not going to be very helpful, and they're going to now shift very squarely into that anti-ambition group that Graham had pointed out. So our best bet is to continue to work with our allies and continue to work with the public and the folks in this audience to really rally around our representatives and have a call to action to get people off their butts and have people pay attention to what we all want and what we all need.
Definitely. So I would say, and I really understand where Christopher's coming from, because it is so hard to not kind of get drawn into it and go through that on a regular basis. But in the end, I would caution us, all of us, from thinking about one avenue of the US government. You know, you still have representatives, you still have congressional representatives. You know, I don't know if many of them are particularly active, but we have seen representation. We have seen congresspeople and senators take action on this. And so in the end, you know, the government works for you. You can let them know that this is important. If you see at our polling, which obviously is around Latinos, but you can find other polling with mainstream focus, this is an issue that transcends political leanings. And so we need to tell our representatives and our governments that this is important to us. And if this is important to you, it doesn't matter if they say no, you just have to keep on doing it. And I guess I just don't see why we should make it easy for the problems to continue to grow. And I don't know, I'm someone that doesn't give up easily. And I would just continue to do that. Pick up your phone. If this is your representative, this is what they're supposed to do. I was very happy to see the call on more sort of like open-minded, and because I think what they said is like, what about NGOs or church, etc. That's exactly the key, right? So some of you are not calling from the US or not following in the US, so it's a different folks. You still have representatives in your home countries, but you also have other avenues, and you know, do have talking about religion and religious groups. We do have religious groups that are very focused on this. Obviously, we have a new pope that has signaled continued diplomacy from the previous pope. And so I would encourage you to find those places, whether that is a representative, whether it's through your faith, through other places that you belong to bring that up and find there's avenues of engagement there, or if not, to create them. I mean, in the end, this is going to be something that we all do together. In the end, it's going to be something that we're going to have to keep on keeping on. And so I would just say, let's not make it easy, because this is something that affects us every day. That's going to affect our children. As a mother, I am not getting up anytime soon. And so I think we just have to keep on keeping on.
Amazing. I love your enthusiasm, Marce. It's so life-giving. It's like, we will not give up. Their job, make them work.
Yes.
And this, to act locally, to get involved locally. Sure, the federal might be like, oh my gosh, but we are it starts locally, getting involved. You're right. We all can do our part. So thank you for that really inspiring call. Graham, do you have anything to add?
The business industry, or sort of industry more broadly in the plastic space, is more diverse than we might think. And I think even some of the most visible and problematic plastic polluters, including Coca-Cola and Nestle, have more progressive positions on the treaty and need to be pressured to continue to advocate for things like global cuts to production. And so they sort of stand opposed to the fossil fuel industry in this space. Those interests are different. And so Greenpeace and many others are pressuring corporations like Nestle and Coke to show up in this space and actually be more progressive. And so that's another way to just sort of engage. We also have an initiative with the Plastic Pollution Coalition called Champions of Change. There's a lot of progressive businesses out there that are truly progressive and looking for ways and alternatives, and to sort of raise their voice to create a more sustainable economic future, and not just for their businesses, but for all of us. And so that's another way that folks can engage. And so pressuring the corporate sector to take action when we have such a dysfunctional government is another way that we can help drive change.
We're also consumers, aren't we? So we've got these corporations that want our dollars. So how can we call them to action? That's great. Thank you for that, Graham. World Oceans Day is in just a few days. And many people first begin to care about this issue because they're ocean lovers. That's me. That's how I came in. And see plastic pollution in the ocean and on beaches. How do plastics move from land to oceans? And how do we solve ocean plastic pollution?
As I mentioned when I introduced myself, that CORE began this effort because of pollution in the ocean, but we quickly realized that it's far more than that. the most important thing, as we've all noted, is that production needs to slow down dramatically. We cannot control the plastic pollution. We cannot control the poison until we control the production. The more we produce, the more ends up out there. And it doesn't matter what kind of mechanisms we have downstream. We really need to shut off the tap or turn the tap down at the very minimum, to use that analogy. And people talk about, oh, these ocean cleanup projects, or we have this and we have this, chemical recycling and this and that and the other thing. But in the end, we all know that if your sink is overflowing, if your toilet is overflowing, or whatever it is, the first thing you do instinctively is turn off the tap. You don't grab another towel, you don't grab a mop. The first thing that anybody does is turn off the tap, because it's the most common sense, and it's innate for us to do that, because it's really the most important step we can take.
I just want to jump in. I could not agree more. Christopher said it well. And everyone should know, this is a direct message to Inger Anderson. If this treaty does not cut plastic production, it will be a massive failure. This will be on the UN, and this will be on every government that participated, and civil society will not let them forget that.
All right, we have a good one last question here, I think, in terms of our timing for this call. What is the most strategic way forward? What gives you hope about the treaty negotiations' success despite the challenges?
I am genuinely excited to see, first of all, this understanding evolve from this, like ocean pollution, marine pollution thing, to a real holistic concern about all parts of this cycle in a fairly short amount of time. So for a very, very long time, we talk about marine pollution, and a couple of years, that understanding has changed significantly. So my hope is that understanding continues to evolve to the point that we adopt actively this turn off the tap, that we understand the emergency that we're on, that we understand the need to have clear, concise, and transparent and equitable rules in this treaty. Because, the problem is there, we all have to live with it. Those of us that have children, and even people that don't, something's got to give. So I am excited about this change. I'm excited about the public interest. I'm excited about the public movement. And you just got to keep on holding on to hope while you try to do your best and keeping on.
I will echo what Marce was saying about how exciting it is that this is becoming a thing. I sort of lean back to I'll call them the old days, when it would be like 5 or 10 people that, my plastic treaty friends, who would be sitting around a table and going to these meetings. And now we go to our NGO meetings or our coalition meetings, and there are hundreds of people who travel around the world to come to these negotiations. It's encouraging, and it like warms my heart, and it gives me hope. And not that we should relish in the chaos that's going on in the world, but the fact that climate change is becoming much more prevalent, and plastic pollution is becoming much more prevalent in the news and everything. People are not denying it anymore. And it used to be something that people would go to their deathbed saying, that's not real, it's not a thing. And now people realize it is a thing. So it gives me hope. And when we look back to how we can have global change and global action, if we look back to the reaction and the action that people took during the pandemic, you can make a decision and you can move forward and you can get on with your life and you can save the world. We can do it.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, you're right. Humans, we're complicated. We do want to understand something, and I do feel like the media has helped us really engage everyone. People get that these are issues, and now let's move forward. That is hopeful. Thanks, Christopher. Graham, how about you? What gives you hope?
I mean, I agree with my fellow panelists here. I think Greenpeace is part of also the Break Free from Plastic movement, which has thousands of organizations around the world. So many people care about this. And I don't know, it was almost a decade ago, Catherine, Jen, and I were on a boat challenging Unilever and Nestle in Europe all those years ago, and we're still at it. And I think even since then, and even in the last 2 years, just one tidbit is that in Busan at INC5, the media narrative, it's gone from like, all right, how are we going to recycle our way out of this problem, to just the media understands, at least tier one media, that recycling won't get us there. And I think that alone, just that fundamental recognition is really important. And so we've made a lot of progress. And again, plastic sort of underpins our entire global economy. And so it's going to be, when we solve this one, we'll be solving a lot of other ones. And I think people are paying attention. So there's a lot of hope. So thank you. Yeah, we got this.
We do have this. Yeah, such a great memory, that boat trip. Yeah, so right, Graham. We are busting myths. We are combating the disinformation and the misinformation that the plastics industry is, disseminating across the internet, and really coming with the truth and solutions as well. So this has been so lovely to hear from you all, and just to hear from everybody who's chimed into the Q&A. Really testament to, as Christopher said, just the growing movement of people getting involved and showing up and caring and wanting to take action for our planet, for our families, for the sea creatures, for the ocean. So really inspiring to hear from you all. Thank you. And thank you to our panelists, Christopher, Graham, and Marseille, for joining us today and providing so much useful information, so many great resources, and such a rich and valuable conversation. Now I'll turn it back over to Rachel. Thank you all.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, everyone. And really happy and thankful for our audience for engaging so much. I want to remind everyone to mark your calendars for our next webinar that's coming up on July 30th, Solutions Series, How Waterless Products Make Plastic-Free Packaging Possible. If you haven't already, we invite you to join our global coalition. It is currently free to join as an individual, business, or a nonprofit organization. You can also connect with us on social media to learn more about our work. And just as a heads up, we'll be sending out a follow-up survey after the webinar, and we really appreciate your feedback. It helps us to improve our future events. So thank you all so much again for joining. Thank you also to our Plastic Pollution Coalition member groups and partners who shared this webinar with their communities and networks. We look so forward to seeing you at our next webinar on July 30th. See you soon. Thank you all.